Somewhere deep in South Carolina's low country, hidden within archives few historians dare to touch, exists a record that was intentionally misfiled for more than a century. Labeled simply as an agricultural dispute from 1847, it quietly details a chain of events so alarming that three of Carolina's most powerful families abandoned their grand estates within a single year, selling their lands at crushing losses and disappearing under assumed names. Publicly, they blamed failed harvests and financial strain, but recently uncovered letters from the Charleston Historical Society reveal a far darker truth. At the center of it all was an enslaved man named Joshua Fletcher, a man forced for 20 years into a brutal system designed to create children he would never be allowed to raise. Paired with 9 different women, each sold away after giving birth, Joshua fathered 17 documented children, all taken before their second birthday. By 1847, something inside him changed. But what followed was not revolt nor escape. It was something more precise, more calculated, and far more devastating to those who thought they controlled him. Joshua created a mirror of the system itself, forcing the plantation owner's 3 sons to experience the same stripping of autonomy, the same cold reduction to property, the same slow realization that their lives were no longer their own. 73 people witnessed the full truth, and every one of them swore an oath of silence that lasted until their deaths. Before we continue uncovering the true story of Joshua Fletcher and the reckoning that shook South Carolina's elite to their core, make sure you are subscribed to Vintage Chains. Turn on the notification bell, because these are the stories history tried to erase, and we bring them back to light. Also, leave a comment below telling us which country you're watching from. Your voice matters here. Riverside Plantation stretched across 2,000 acres of fertile lowland, bordered by the Combahee River to the east and dense maritime forest to the west. The estate had belonged to the Grantham family since 1783, passed down through generations of unbroken wealth and influence. By 1847, Elias Grantham III stood not only as master of Riverside, but as a dominant figure among the plantation aristocracy, his authority echoing through Charleston's political and social circles. The plantation functioned like a self-contained empire. 147 enslaved people toiled in the rice fields, their labor funding a towering 3-story manor adorned with imported Italian marble and French crystal chandeliers, symbols of luxury built on silent suffering. What unfolded during those 7 months would forever alter the balance of power, proving that those who created systems of cruelty never imagined what would happen if someone learned them well enough to turn them back. And what happened next would be whispered only behind closed doors. Elias Grantham III, 52 years old in 1847, ran his estate with what he considered enlightened management. Less brutal than some of his neighbors, more pragmatic than cruel, he prided himself on rarely using the whip, preferring instead what he called natural incentives and proper breeding programs. This last point formed the cornerstone of Grantham's agricultural philosophy. He had studied the writings of plantation theorists who advocated for selective breeding among enslaved populations, treating human reproduction with the same calculated attention other planters gave to livestock. Grantham maintained detailed records in leather-bound ledgers, noting physical characteristics, temperament, and lineage. He arranged pairings with business-like precision, separating couples who failed to produce children quickly enough, and rewarding those who bore numerous offspring with slightly better rations and less arduous work assignments. Joshua Fletcher had been born at Riverside in 1809. The son of 2 people, Grantham's father had deliberately paired for what the ledgers called prime physical specimens. Joshua's mother, marked in the records only as Celia, strong constitution, good teeth, had been forced into unions with 3 different men over 12 years, bearing 7 children who were all separated from her before their 10th birthdays and sold to distant plantations. Joshua's father, listed as Samuel, exceptional height and strength, had been paired with 11 different women during his years at Riverside, producing 23 documented children he would never know. Joshua himself inherited his parents' physical characteristics. He stood 6'4" inches tall in an era when the average man measured 5'8", and he possessed unusual strength that made him valuable in the rice fields. By age 16, he had been designated by Elias Grantham, the 2 as prime breeding stock. Over the next 2 decades, Joshua was forced into unions with 9 different women, most of whom were sold away shortly after bearing children. The ledgers recorded these transactions with clinical detachment. Joshua paired with Ruth, 1,825. 2 children produced. Ruth sold to Georgia plantation, 1,827. Joshua paired with Hannah, 1,827. The pattern continued for 20 years. Joshua produced 17 documented children, none of whom he was permitted to raise or in most cases even see beyond their infancy. The women were sold away to prevent emotional attachments that might reduce productivity. The children were dispersed across the Deep South, their parentage noted only in Grantham's private records, valuable property scattered across state lines. By 1847, Joshua Fletcher was 38 years old, his body still powerful, but his eyes carrying something that made even the overseers uncomfortable. He spoke little, worked with mechanical efficiency, and showed no outward signs of resistance. Elias Grantham III considered him one of the plantation's most valuable assets, a man who had generated significant profit through his offspring while remaining apparently utterly compliant. The Grandantham family itself consisted of Elias III, his wife Margaret, and their three sons, Elias IV, a 23, Robert, a 21, and Thomas, age 19. All three young men had been educated at the College of Charleston and had returned to Riverside to learn plantation management under their father's guidance. They moved through the estate with the casual confidence of young aristocrats, secure in their position at the top of a rigid social hierarchy that seemed as permanent as the river itself. The spring of 1847 arrived with unusual heat, the kind that made the rice fields shimmer and turned the air thick as cotton. It was during this season that a series of events began to unfold. Events that would be documented in fragments, whispered about in coded language, and eventually buried so deeply in historical records that they nearly vanished entirely. The first indication that something had shifted at Riverside Plantation came not with violence or confrontation, but with a request that seemed on its surface entirely reasonable. On the morning of April 3, 1847, Joshua Fletcher approached the overseer, a man named William Pritchard, during the midday water break. Several enslaved workers later remembered the conversation, though they claimed not to understand its significance at the time. Joshua asked, with what witnesses described as unusual formality, to speak with Master Grantham about a matter of property management. Pritchard, surprised that Joshua would initiate such a request, nevertheless agreed to relay the message. That evening, Elias Grantham III received Joshua in the plantation office, a small building separate from the main house where business transactions were conducted. Grantham later documented this meeting in a private journal entry that would be discovered only after his death, an entry he titled simply "The Beginning." According to Grantham's account, Joshua stood before the desk with perfect posture and spoke in clear, measured tones. He had, he explained, been thinking about Master Grantham's breeding program and had developed some observations that might prove profitable. Joshua noted that he had produced 17 children over 20 years, but that Master Grantham had been forced to sell away the mothers, breaking up potential multi-generational advantages. What if, Joshua suggested, there were a way to create more stable breeding lines that would increase the plantation's long-term value? Grantham, intrigued by what seemed like unusual business acumen from an enslaved man, asked Joshua to elaborate. What followed was a presentation that Grantham later described as disturbingly sophisticated. Joshua outlined a theoretical breeding program that would keep families together through multiple generations, allowing for the study of inherited traits and the development of specialized labor lines. He spoke about genetics, a term that made Grantham pause, as it reflected knowledge typically restricted to educated planters, and suggested that Riverside could become a model for other estates if such a program proved successful. Impressed despite himself, Grantham asked Joshua where he had acquired such knowledge. Joshua's response was simple. He had been listening, watching, and learning for 38 years. Every conversation between master and overseer, every discussion of breeding theory, every business transaction, all of it had been absorbed and analyzed by a mind that Grantham had assumed was incapable of such sophisticated thought. The meeting ended with Grantham promising to consider Joshua's suggestions. He dismissed the man and sat alone in his office as twilight fell, experiencing what he described in his journal as a peculiar unease, as if I had suddenly discovered that my horse could speak Latin. 3 days later, something happened that no one at Riverside could have anticipated. Elias Grantham IV, the eldest son and heir to the plantation, disappeared. He vanished between the main house and the stables, a distance of perhaps 200 yards in broad daylight. A search was organized immediately with overseers and enslaved workers combing every structure, field, and section of forest. They found no signs of struggle, no indication of flight, and no evidence of violence. It was as if the young man had simply ceased to exist. The search continued for 3 days. Neighboring plantations were alerted, patrols were organized, and advertisements were placed in Charleston newspapers. On the evening of the 3rd day, a note was discovered tucked into the back of Elias Grantham III's breeding ledger, the very book that contained detailed records of Joshua Fletcher's forced pairings and separated children. The note, written in surprisingly educated handwriting, read, "Your son is safe and well treated. He is learning what it means to be property. When you are ready to negotiate his return, send word through the man Joshua Fletcher. Tell no one else of this communication or you will never see your son again." Grantham's hands reportedly shook as he read the message. The implications were staggering. Not just that his son had been taken, but that the taking had been planned with sufficient sophistication to circumvent all the plantation security measures. More disturbing still was the phrase "learning what it means to be property," which suggested something more complex than simple ransom. Grantham immediately sought out Joshua Fletcher, finding him in the quarters after the day's work had ended. The conversation that followed was witnessed by no one, but Grantham's journal entry that night conveyed his profound shock at what he learned. Joshua explained with the same measured tone he had used in their previous meeting that young Elias IV was indeed safe and unharmed. He was being held in a location that would never be found through searching. But his treatment, Joshua continued, would depend entirely on the cooperation of Elias Grantham III. A breeding program was about to begin at Riverside, Joshua said, but not the kind the master had ever imagined. Joshua laid out his terms with chilling precision. Elias Grantham III would continue to operate the plantation as before, maintaining all normal appearances. But in secret, a new program would begin, one in which the Grantham sons would experience exactly what Joshua and countless others had endured. They would be paired with women not of their choosing, forced into unions designed to produce children, and separated from any offspring that resulted. If Master Grantham refused, or if he sought outside help, his eldest son would disappear forever into the vast network of enslaved people moving along the Underground Railroad, but moving south, not north, into the deepest parts of Georgia and Alabama, where a white man without papers would be assumed to be an escaped indentured servant and likely worked to death in the turpentine camps. The genius of Joshua's plan, as Grantham later acknowledged in his journal, was that it exploited the master's own system against him. To seek help from authorities or neighboring planters would require Grantham to explain that he had been outwitted by an enslaved man, a humiliation that would destroy his social standing and business reputation. Moreover, any investigation would inevitably uncover his own breeding program, which some considered controversial, even among slaveholders. Grantham was trapped by the very structure of power he had thought unassailable. That night, Elias Grantham III made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He agreed to Joshua Fletcher's terms. The implementation of what Joshua called the reckoning began with methodical precision that suggested months, perhaps years of careful planning. Elias IV was returned to the plantation exactly 1 week after his disappearance, delivered to the edge of the property in the pre-dawn hours, and discovered by field workers who immediately alerted the main house. The young man appeared physically unharmed but psychologically altered. He spoke little about his captivity, and when pressed by his father, would only say that he had been treated with exactly the consideration I have shown others. His eyes carried a haunted quality that would never entirely fade, but his return came with new demands that expanded the scope of Joshua's plan. Within the plantation slave quarters, a building had been quietly modified. What had once served as a storage shed for tools had been transformed into a secure structure with reinforced doors and small high windows. The work had been done at night over several weeks unnoticed by the overseers who rarely ventured into the quarters after dark. Inside, the space had been divided into 3 small rooms, each furnished with only a narrow bed, a small table, and a chamber pot. Joshua's instructions to Elias Grantham III were explicit and non-negotiable. All 3 Grantham sons would participate in the breeding program. They would be confined to the modified building during evening hours from dusk until dawn. During daylight, they would be required to work in the fields under the same conditions as the enslaved laborers, though their work would be limited to less visible sections of the plantation to avoid detection by visitors. Most critically, each son would be paired with a woman selected by Joshua, and these pairings would continue until pregnancies resulted. The women chosen for this purpose were not random selections. Joshua had identified 3 enslaved women at Riverside who had been separated from their own children through Grantham's breeding program. Each had experienced the trauma of forced pairings and subsequent separation from their offspring. Each had reasons to participate in what Joshua described as teaching these men what they have done to others. But here, Joshua's plan revealed a complexity that transcended simple revenge. The women were given absolute choice in their participation. Joshua made clear that they could refuse without any consequences and that their involvement must be entirely voluntary. He explained that the goal was not to replicate the violence of the plantation system, but to create a situation where the Grantham sons experienced the psychological weight of being treated as breeding stock, the loss of autonomy, the reduction to physical function, the awareness of being valued only for reproductive capacity. 2 of the 3 women initially agreed to participate. The third, a woman named Sarah, who had borne and lost 4 children to sale, refused on the grounds that she could not, even in these circumstances, participate in something that echoed her own trauma. Joshua accepted her decision immediately and sought no replacement. This detail, recorded in a letter written by Sarah many years later, suggested that Joshua's intentions were more nuanced than pure retribution. The program began in late April of 1847. The Grantham sons were confined each night to their separate rooms. They were provided adequate food and water, given basic medical attention when needed, and were not physically harmed. But they were also stripped of all autonomy regarding their personal lives and reproductive futures. They were informed that they would be paired with their assigned partners until pregnancies occurred, and that any resulting children would be separated from them immediately after birth. Elias Grantham III, bound by his agreement and terrified of losing his sons entirely, maintained the facade of normal plantation operations. He told neighbors that his sons were engaged in an intensive agricultural study that required their full attention, explaining their absence from social events and church services. He increased security around the plantation's perimeter while simultaneously allowing Joshua unprecedented freedom of movement within the estate. What happened during those months remains documented only in fragments, brief journal entries, coded letters, and testimonies given decades later under different names. But certain facts emerged clearly from these scattered sources. The psychological impact on the Grantham sons was profound and immediate. Robert, the middle son, attempted to escape twice during the first month, both times being returned by enslaved workers who had been organized by Joshua into an efficient surveillance network. After the second attempt, Robert reportedly experienced a complete emotional collapse, spending days in what his father described as a state of cataleptic despair. He had confronted suddenly and absolutely the reality of powerlessness, the understanding that his body, his time, and his future were no longer his to control. Thomas, the youngest, took a different approach. He attempted to negotiate with the women assigned to him, trying to form genuine human connections that might somehow redeem the situation. But he discovered painfully that sincerity under coercion carries little meaning. The woman paired with him, a seamstress named Rebecca, explained with patient precision that his desire for her emotional participation was itself a form of violence, expecting her to provide not just physical compliance, but also the comfort of believing he was different from other masters who had used her and others like her. Elias IV, who had already experienced a week of captivity before the program began, responded with withdrawal into silence. He performed what was required of him with mechanical compliance, but spoke almost nothing, even to his brothers or father. He had understood something fundamental about the system he had been born into, and that understanding had broken something essential in his character. Meanwhile, Joshua Fletcher continued to work in the rice fields during the day, showing no outward signs of his central role in these events. Overseers later testified that he remained the most reliable worker on the plantation, completing his tasks with the same steady efficiency he had always shown. At night, however, he became something else entirely, an administrator of his own counter-plantation, ensuring that his program ran according to his exacting standards. The genius of Joshua's plan extended beyond the immediate situation. He had carefully documented everything in a series of letters addressed to abolition societies in Philadelphia and Boston. These letters detailed not only his own breeding program for the Grantham sons, but also provided comprehensive evidence of Elias Grantham III's decades-long breeding program for enslaved people. The letters were held by trusted intermediaries with instructions to mail them if Joshua disappeared or if the program was disrupted prematurely. This created a checkmate situation. Greenham could not eliminate Joshua without triggering the release of information that would destroy his reputation and potentially lead to legal consequences, as some aspects of his breeding program violated even the lenient standards of the time. Joshua, meanwhile, had created a situation where the plantation owner was forced to participate in the oppression of his own children, experiencing firsthand the moral weight of decisions he had made casually for decades. By June of 1847, the situation at Riverside Plantation had developed additional layers of complexity that no one, including Joshua Fletcher, had fully anticipated. The first pregnancy was confirmed in early June. Rebecca, the woman paired with Thomas Grantham, was carrying a child. The news created an immediate crisis because it forced everyone involved to confront the logical endpoint of Joshua's program. What would actually happen when a child was born from these forced unions? Would Joshua truly separate the Grantham sons from their offspring, replicating the exact trauma that had defined his own life? This question became the subject of intense debate among the enslaved community at Riverside. Some believed Joshua would follow through with absolute precision, arguing that only by experiencing the complete cycle of breeding, birth, and separation would the Grantham sons truly understand what they had done to others. Others, including Sarah, who had refused to participate, argued that perpetuating such trauma, even as education, would corrupt the moral foundation of the entire undertaking. Joshua himself remained silent on his intentions, which only increased the tension. He continued to maintain his program with unwavering consistency, but he also began to exhibit signs of psychological strain. Several enslaved workers later reported finding Joshua sitting alone at night, staring at his hands in the moonlight as if they belonged to someone else. The weight of power, even righteous power exercised against oppressors, was revealing itself to be its own burden. Meanwhile, something unexpected was occurring among the Grantham sons themselves. The shared trauma of their situation began to break down the hierarchies that had previously defined their relationships. Elias IV, Robert, and Thomas had always competed for their father's approval, each trying to prove himself worthy of managing the plantation, but their current circumstances eliminated those distinctions. In their evening confinement, they were all equally powerless, all equally reduced to biological function. This leveling created space for conversations they had never previously had. They began to discuss tentatively at first, and then with increasing urgency, the moral foundations of everything they had been raised to accept. Robert, who had attempted escape twice, confessed that his desperation to flee stemmed not from physical fear, but from the crushing realization that his entire worldview had been built on comfortable lies. Thomas spoke about his attempts to form genuine connections with Rebecca and his dawning understanding that kindness under coercion is simply refined cruelty. Most significantly, Elias IV began to articulate something that approached genuine moral reckoning. In a conversation his brothers later recounted, he described his week of initial captivity, how he had been kept in darkness, fed minimal rations, and forced to perform meaningless labor for hours each day. But the worst part, he explained, was not the physical hardship. It was the moment when he realized that his captors viewed him with the same casual indifference he had shown to enslaved people throughout his life. He was to them simply a tool, an object whose suffering merited no more consideration than one would give to a broken plow. These emerging insights created an unexpected problem for Elias Grantham III. His sons were supposed to be learning a harsh lesson that would eventually end, allowing them to return to their proper roles as plantation managers, but instead they were developing perspectives that fundamentally contradicted the economic and social foundations of the family's wealth. They were becoming, in essence, internal critics of the very system that defined them. Grantham documented his growing alarm in his journal. He recognized that Joshua's program was succeeding beyond its apparent intentions. It was not simply punishing his sons, but transforming them into people who could no longer comfortably operate within the plantation aristocracy. This realization brought with it a question that Grantham found deeply disturbing. Was Joshua Fletcher more sophisticated than even he himself had understood? Had this entire program been designed not just to inflict equivalent suffering, but to destroy the psychological foundations that allowed plantation society to function? The answer came in the third week of June, when Joshua finally explained his full intentions to Elias Grantham III. They met again in the plantation office, this time with Joshua standing not as a subordinate, but as something closer to an equal. Joshua laid out the remainder of his plan with the same methodical precision he had shown from the beginning. Rebekah's child would be born in approximately 7 months. When that occurred, Thomas would be permitted to see his child exactly once, immediately after birth. Then the child would be separated from Thomas and raised by Rebekah as her own, with Thomas having no further contact or parental rights. This pattern would continue for any other pregnancies that resulted from the program. But here, Joshua added a crucial detail that he had withheld until now. The children born from these unions would not be enslaved. Joshua had secured promises from abolition networks in the North that they would provide false documentation establishing free status for any children born from his program. These children would be raised with full knowledge of their parentage and the circumstances of their conception. They would become living testimonies to what had occurred at Riverside Plantation, evidence that could never be destroyed or hidden. The brilliance of this arrangement was its permanence. Even if Joshua's program ended, even if the Grantham sons eventually returned to normal life, these children would exist as permanent reminders of what had transpired. They would be in effect walking documentation of the reversal that had occurred, proof that the logic of the breeding program, when applied to those who created it, was fundamentally intolerable. Grantham listened to this explanation with what he described in his journal as a horror beyond anything I have previously known. He realized that Joshua had created something more sophisticated than revenge. He had created a mirror that would follow the Grantham family forever, reflecting back the choices they had made for generations. But Joshua was not finished. He had one more revelation that would shift the situation yet again. He informed Grantham that his program had never been solely about the Grandantham sons. Throughout the past 3 months, Joshua had been in communication with enslaved people on 7 neighboring plantations, estates where similar breeding programs had been implemented, where families had been systematically separated, where human beings had been reduced to reproductive stock. Joshua had shared his methods, his strategies, and his success at Riverside. Other programs, he suggested, were already beginning. This was the moment when Elias Grantham III understood the true scope of what he was facing. Joshua Fletcher had not simply sought revenge against one family. He had initiated a form of resistance that could potentially replicate across the entire region. If enslaved people at multiple plantations simultaneously began implementing similar programs, the entire economic and social structure of the Low Country could be threatened, the psychological impact on the planter class would be devastating, and the potential for violent response would be catastrophic. Grantham asked with what he admitted was barely controlled panic. What Joshua wanted? What would end this program? What would prevent its spread to other plantations? Joshua's response revealed the final layer of his plan. He wanted nothing for himself. He was, he explained, already 40 years old and had accepted that his own life had been consumed by the system he was now subverting. But he wanted something for the children, both those who had already been born through forced breeding programs and those who would be born in the future. He demanded that Grantham use his considerable social and political influence to advocate for laws restricting family separation in the slave system. That is to say, not abolition, which Joshua recognized as politically impossible in South Carolina, but targeted reforms that would prevent the most brutal aspects of breeding programs. He wanted Grantham to speak openly about his own practices, to admit publicly what he had done, and to argue that such practices were not only immoral, but economically inefficient. It was an impossible demand, and both men knew it. For Grantham to do what Joshua asked would require social and economic suicide. He would be ostracized by his peers. His business relationships would collapse and his family's reputation would be destroyed. He would lose everything he had spent his life building. But the alternative, allowing Joshua's program to continue and potentially spread, was equally unthinkable. Grantham asked for time to consider his options. Joshua granted him 1 week. During that time, the breeding program would continue as established, and the surveillance network would remain alert for any attempts to seek outside help or to sabotage the agreement. The meeting ended with both men understanding that they had reached a critical juncture. What had begun as a specific act of revenge against one family had evolved into something larger, a fundamental challenge to the assumptions underlying the entire plantation economy. The question now was whether that challenge could be contained or whether it would spiral into something that neither man could control. Just when everything seemed to be reaching an impossible tension, another development occurred that would transform the situation once more. But before we continue with this next shocking turn in the story of Joshua Fletcher and Riverside Plantation, let's take a moment. If this account is affecting you as deeply as it affected those who first uncovered these records, share this video with someone who appreciates the complex and often dark truths of American history. Hit that like button to support content that doesn't shy away from difficult subjects. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because stories like this, stories that were deliberately hidden for over a century, are what we're committed to bringing to light. Let's discover together what happens next at Riverside Plantation. The week of deliberation that Elias Grantham III had requested became 7 days of escalating crisis that would ultimately force resolution in a manner no one had anticipated. On the third day of that week, a development occurred that shattered the careful equilibrium Joshua had maintained. One of the neighboring plantations, the Carmichael Estate, located approximately 6 miles downriver, experienced its own version of what had happened at Riverside. The eldest Carmichael's son disappeared under circumstances eerily similar to Elias IV's initial vanishing. Within 2 days, notes appeared making demands nearly identical to Joshua's. This replication had not been authorized by Joshua. In fact, when word reached him through the enslaved communication network, his reaction was immediate alarm. His plan had depended on controlled implementation, careful documentation, and strategic pressure applied to specific targets who could be leveraged into advocacy. Uncontrolled spread of his methods would lead to violent suppression and mass retaliation against the enslaved population. Joshua moved quickly to make contact with whoever had initiated the Carmichael action using the same underground networks that had facilitated his own program. What he discovered was both predictable and disturbing. A group of enslaved men at the Carmichael estate had heard rumors about Riverside and had attempted to implement their own version without understanding the careful safeguards Joshua had established. They had not secured documentation for potential children. They had not created the checkmate situation with letters to abolition societies, and had not established clear endpoints for their program. The Carmichael situation was escalating toward violence. The plantation owner had contacted neighboring estates, and a coordinated response was being organized. Slave patrols were being mobilized, and discussions were occurring about making examples that would discourage any similar actions. Grantham received word through his business networks that several plantation owners were proposing a regional meeting to address what they were calling coordinated insurrection. The language being used suggested not targeted punishment, but wholesale suppression, the kind that would result in dozens of executions, and the implementation of even more brutal control measures across the entire Low Country. Joshua understood immediately that his own program was now in jeopardy. The careful moral and strategic framework he had constructed would be swept away in a wave of suppression that would treat all resistance as identical. The distinction between his targeted strategic action and the Carmichael improvisation would be irrelevant to planters who saw only a threat to their authority. Moreover, the women who had participated in his program, Rebecca, who was now visibly pregnant, and the 2 others, would almost certainly face brutal interrogation and punishment once the region descended into panic-driven retaliation. He made a decision that would define the final phase of his reckoning. Joshua went to Elias Grantham III and proposed something extraordinary. They would work together to resolve both situations. Joshua would use his influence among the enslaved networks to negotiate the peaceful conclusion of the Carmichael action, securing the safe return of the missing son and the safety of those who had taken him. In exchange, Grantham would use his political connections to ensure that no mass retaliation occurred and that the incident would be quietly resolved without the usual brutal suppression. But Joshua's proposal included a larger component. He suggested that Grantham could use the Carmichael incident as cover for implementing the reforms Joshua had originally demanded. Grantham could argue to other planters that family separation policies were creating dangerous instabilities, that breeding programs were generating organized resistance, and that strategic reforms were necessary for the preservation of the entire system. Grantham could present himself as a pragmatic voice for limited change, motivated not by moral concerns, but by economic and security interests. It was a compromise that would allow both men to achieve partial objectives while avoiding the catastrophic violence that seemed increasingly inevitable. Joshua would not get public admission of wrongdoing or full implementation of his demands, but he would get meaningful reforms that would reduce some forms of suffering. Grantham would not face social suicide, but he would have to use his influence in ways that would distance him from his previous practices and mark him as controversial among his peers. The negotiation that followed was documented by Grantham in surprising detail, perhaps because he recognized its historical significance. Over 3 intense days, Joshua and Grantham hammered out an agreement that addressed immediate crises while establishing longer-term changes. They met in the plantation office after nightfall, when Grantham could be certain no overseers or neighbors would observe these extraordinary conferences. The discussions were heated at times. Grantham objected to several of Joshua's demands as impossibly idealistic, while Joshua pushed back against what he saw as Grantham's attempts to minimize his commitments. During one particularly tense exchange on the second night of negotiations, Joshua presented Grantham with something the planter had never seen before, a detailed ledger that mirrored Grantham's own breeding records, but told the story from a different perspective. Joshua had been keeping his own documentation for 20 years, recording not just the births and sales that Grantham tracked, but the human cost of each transaction. Names of women who had become emotionally devastated after separations, children who had cried for parents they would never see again, the physical and psychological toll of forced reproductive partnerships. The ledger was meticulous, comprehensive, and devastating in its implications. Grantham later wrote that seeing his own system documented from the perspective of those who suffered under it was more effective than any moral argument could have been. The clinical detachment he had maintained when recording his own breeding program became impossible when confronted with Joshua's counter-narrative. He realized that Joshua had not simply endured the system, he had analyzed it, understood it more completely than Grantham himself did, and used that understanding to dismantle it from within. The turning point in their negotiation came when they addressed what would happen to the Grantham sons. Grantham initially wanted them to return to Riverside and resume their previous lives, perhaps with some modifications in their attitudes, but essentially unchanged in their social positions. Joshua refused absolutely. He argued that allowing the sons to return to privilege without consequence would negate everything the program had been designed to teach. The sons had experienced a fraction of what enslaved people endured daily. If they returned to comfort and power, that experience would become merely an unpleasant memory, rather than a transformative education. Joshua's alternative proposal was radical. The sons should be sent away permanently, given new identities in the North, and required to work for their own livelihood without access to family wealth or connections for at least 5 years. During that time, they should be required to support abolition work financially, directing their earnings toward organizations that helped formerly enslaved people establish free lives. Only after demonstrating sustained commitment to opposing the system that had created them should they be allowed to access family resources. Grantham initially rejected this as too extreme, but Joshua's response cut through his objections with brutal clarity. He pointed out that enslaved mothers at Riverside had been permanently separated from their children, with no guarantee of ever seeing them again, no ability to provide financial support, and no expectation that their suffering would end after a set period. If 5 years of separation and reduced circumstances seemed unbearable to Grantham, what did that say about the system he had operated for decades? The logic was undeniable, and Grantham eventually acquiesced to a modified version of Joshua's proposal. The sons would relocate to Ohio, would be given sufficient resources to establish businesses, but not enough to live in luxury, and would be expected to support abolition causes financially. Grantham would maintain minimal contact with them for 3 years, allowing them to establish independent identities separate from their plantation heritage. For the immediate situation, Joshua would facilitate the peaceful return of the Carmichael son and the de-escalation of that conflict. Grantham's own sons would be released from their confinement, and the breeding program at Riverside would end. Rebecca, who was carrying Thomas's child, would be granted her freedom along with her unborn child with documentation that Joshua had secured from his northern contacts. The 2 other women who had participated in Joshua's program would also be granted freedom along with financial resources sufficient to establish independent lives. Additionally, 10 other enslaved families at Riverside would be granted freedom papers over the following year selected by Joshua based on their particular vulnerabilities or suffering under the breeding program. For the longer term, Grantham would spend the next 2 years using his political influence to advocate for restrictions on family separation in the South Carolina slave system. He would not expose his own practices directly, but he would speak in legislative sessions and in private meetings with other planters about the security risks and economic inefficiencies of breeding programs. He would quietly support the Underground Railroad by failing to investigate certain escapes from Riverside and neighboring estates. And he would maintain correspondence with Joshua for the remainder of his life, providing regular accounts of his advocacy efforts. The agreement also addressed the question that had created so much tension. What would happen to the children born from Joshua's program? Rebecca would raise her child as free with regular financial support from Grantham that would be framed as payment for past labor. The child would be told the truth about their parentage and conception when they reached adulthood. Thomas would have no parental rights, but would be permitted to provide financial support through Grantham's intermediation if he chose. Most significantly, Joshua insisted on creating a trust fund for the child, funded by Grantham's estate, that would provide education and resources into adulthood, ensuring that this child, born from coercion, would have opportunities that purely free birth might not guarantee. On the seventh day, the deadline Joshua had set for Grantham's decision, both men took actions that would permanently alter the trajectory of their lives. Joshua orchestrated the peaceful resolution of the Carmichael crisis, negotiating terms that secured the safety of everyone involved and prevented the mass retaliation that had seemed imminent. He traveled personally to the Carmichael estate using networks of trusted intermediaries to arrange a meeting with the enslaved men who had taken the plantation heir. The negotiation was delicate. These men were angry, traumatized, and skeptical of any resolution that didn't result in fundamental change. Joshua spoke to them with a combination of empathy and pragmatism, acknowledging the justice of their anger while explaining the tactical realities they faced. He shared details of his own program at Riverside, including both its successes and its limitations, and he outlined a path forward that would secure their safety while advancing longer-term goals. The Carmichael son was returned unharmed, and the enslaved men who had taken him were quietly relocated to northern states through underground railroad networks, avoiding the executions that would certainly have followed if authorities had been involved. Joshua provided them with contacts in Philadelphia and Boston, along with documentation and recommendations that would help them establish new lives. He also extracted a promise from the Carmichael family, negotiated through Grantham's intermediation, that no retaliation would occur against the remaining enslaved population at their estate. A promise backed by the implicit threat that any such retaliation would result in the full story becoming public through Abolition Society publications. Grantham, meanwhile, called a meeting of neighboring plantation owners and presented a carefully constructed narrative about recent disturbances in the region. He argued that increased organization among enslaved populations was being driven by specific policies, particularly family separation and breeding programs that created both psychological trauma and strategic motivation for resistance. He proposed that limited targeted reforms would reduce these pressures without fundamentally altering the economic system. His arguments were pragmatic rather than moral, focused on security and profit rather than justice. He presented data from his own estate showing that enslaved workers who maintained family connections were more productive and less likely to attempt escape or sabotage. He warned that the alternative to modest reform was escalating resistance that would require increasingly brutal and expensive suppression. His proposals were met with resistance and skepticism from most of his peers, but they also initiated conversations that would continue for years. Several plantation owners, frightened by the Carmichael incident and concerned about their own security, began quietly modifying their policies regarding family separation. Others rejected Grantham's suggestions entirely and doubled down on violent control measures. Grantham had successfully introduced ideas that would gradually incrementally influence regional practices, even as the larger system of slavery continued until its eventual abolition through civil war. The breeding program at Riverside formally ended on the same day the agreement was finalized. The Grantham sons were released from their confinement and informed by their father that they would be leaving South Carolina permanently. Elias Grantham III had arranged for them to relocate to Ohio, where they would establish business operations far from the plantation economy that had shaped their childhoods. He could no longer trust that they would maintain the social and economic structures he had spent his life defending, and their presence at Riverside had become a liability. The final meeting between Elias Grantham III and his sons was documented in a letter Thomas later wrote to a friend. Grantham told them that what they had experienced was a consequence of choices he had made, choices he could no longer fully defend, but could not entirely renounce without destroying everything he had built. He acknowledged that they had been harmed by his decisions, just as countless enslaved people had been harmed by those same decisions. He did not ask for forgiveness, but he did express something close to regret, a recognition that the world he had helped create was fundamentally unjust, even if he lacked the courage to fully oppose it. The sons departed Riverside without ceremony, traveling north with minimal possessions and uncertain futures. They never returned to South Carolina, not even for their father's funeral. Joshua Fletcher was also freed as part of the agreement, though he chose not to relocate to the north. Instead, he remained in the South Carolina Low Country, working as what records describe as an itinerant laborer and advocate. He spent the remaining years of his life moving between plantations, speaking with enslaved people about resistance strategies, documentation methods, and negotiation tactics. He became a figure whispered about in slave quarters across the region, a man who had proven that the system could be challenged through intelligence and organization, not just through flight or open rebellion. His methods were studied, adapted, and occasionally replicated, though never again with the same comprehensive success he achieved at Riverside. The winter of 1848 brought a kind of accounting to the events that had transformed Riverside Plantation and the surrounding region. The changes were subtle enough that most observers would not have noticed them, but they were profound for those directly involved. Rebecca gave birth to a daughter in February of 1848. The child was recorded in official documents as freeborn, the daughter of Rebecca Fletcher. Rebecca had taken Joshua's surname as her own when granted her freedom. Thomas Grantham sent financial support through his father's intermediation as the agreement specified, but he never met his daughter. The arrangement had been designed to spare the child from the confusion of having a father who existed only as a distant financial contributor, while also ensuring that Thomas experienced the permanent separation that enslaved fathers had endured for generations. Thomas would eventually marry in Ohio and father 4 legitimate children, but letters discovered after his death suggested that he never stopped thinking about the daughter he was prevented from knowing. He wrote to his wife shortly before his death in 1889, "There is a woman in Philadelphia now 40 years old who carries my blood and my name but knows me only as a historical fact. I provided money for her education and her establishment in life, but I was never permitted to be her father. This was just though justice has proven more painful than I imagined when I was 19 years old." The daughter, who took the name Sarah Fletcher after her mother's grandmother, grew up in Philadelphia in a community of formerly enslaved people and abolitionists. She was told the full story of her conception and birth when she turned 18, and her response was documented in a letter she wrote to Joshua Fletcher in 1866. She expressed gratitude for her freedom and opportunities, anger at the system that had made her existence possible only through coercion, and a complex ambivalence about her father that she would carry throughout her life. She became a teacher and an activist working with formerly enslaved people during Reconstruction, and she raised her own children with detailed knowledge of their unusual family history. Her descendants include educators, civil rights activists, and historians who have worked to preserve the story of Joshua Fletcher and Riverside Plantation. The 2 other women who had participated in Joshua's program relocated to Philadelphia, where they joined a community of formerly enslaved people and became active in abolition work. Their testimonies given decades later to historians documenting the slavery era provided some of the most detailed accounts of what had occurred at Riverside. They spoke about the complexity of their participation, the satisfaction of challenging power structures combined with the trauma of being involved in any reproductive coercion, even one designed to educate oppressors. One of them, a woman named Elizabeth, who had been paired with Robert Grantham but had not become pregnant, described the experience as simultaneously liberating and haunting. "We had power over those who had always held absolute power over us. But exercising that power required us to participate in a system we despised." Their testimonies revealed the moral ambiguity at the heart of Joshua's program and sparked debates among abolitionists about the ethics of using oppressive methods to educate oppressors. Elias Grantham IV, Robert and Thomas never returned to South Carolina. They established successful businesses in Ohio involved in manufacturing and trade rather than agriculture. Historical records suggest they maintained minimal contact with their father and avoided discussing their childhoods. Thomas, in particular, became known for supporting gradual abolition movements, though he never spoke publicly about his personal experiences. He donated significant portions of his business profits to Underground Railroad operations and to organizations supporting formerly enslaved people. His brothers followed similar paths, though with varying degrees of commitment. Elias IV became increasingly reclusive as he aged, troubled by what his nephew later described as demons he could never fully name or exorcise. Robert threw himself into business with almost manic intensity, as if constant work could somehow compensate for or erase the past. The psychological impact of their months in confinement stayed with them throughout their lives. Friends and business associates later described all 3 brothers as unusually sensitive to issues of personal autonomy and human dignity, though the source of these convictions remained mysterious to those who knew them. A business partner of Thomas wrote in 1881 that Thomas had once walked away from a lucrative contract when he learned that the other party employed child labor in dangerous conditions, saying only, "I know what it means to be treated as property, and I will not profit from such treatment of others." When pressed for details about this cryptic statement, Thomas refused to elaborate, maintaining the oath of silence that all 73 people who knew the full truth had sworn to uphold. Elias Grantham III continued operating Riverside Plantation until his death in 1859, but the estate's character changed significantly. He reduced his enslaved population by half over the course of a decade, selling off sections of the plantation and transitioning to less labor-intensive crops. The breeding program was permanently discontinued. And while Grantham did not free all the enslaved people at Riverside, he did modify policies to reduce family separations and improve living conditions. He maintained correspondence with Joshua until 1856, when Joshua's letters abruptly stopped. It was later discovered that Joshua had died of pneumonia while traveling between plantations during a particularly harsh winter. Grantham's response to learning of Joshua's death, recorded in his journal, was surprisingly emotional. "The only man who ever saw me truly has departed this world. I do not know whether to feel relief or loss. He held a mirror to my face and forced me to look at what I had become. And though I could not fully turn away from the system that made me, I could at least see it clearly. That sight has tormented me every day since our agreement was made, but it has also been the only honest relationship I have ever had. I am diminished by his absence." Grantham's advocacy for limited reforms in the slave system produced mixed results. He successfully influenced several local planters to modify their family separation policies, and he provided quiet support for underground railroad operations that helped dozens of enslaved people escape to freedom. His speeches in legislative sessions were noted for their unusual perspectives. He argued that enslaved people were far more intelligent and strategic than most planters acknowledged, and that underestimating them created security vulnerabilities. These arguments made him unpopular among more traditional plantation owners who saw any acknowledgement of enslaved intelligence as dangerous. But the larger legislative reforms he advocated never gained significant traction. The South Carolina political establishment was too invested in the existing system to accept meaningful changes, and Grantham's own social standing declined as he became known as someone sympathetic to what his peers considered dangerous ideas. By the late 1852s, he was increasingly isolated from the planter aristocracy he had once belonged to, viewed as either a traitor or a fool, depending on who was assessing him. In his final years, Grantham attempted to document what had happened at Riverside, creating the detailed private journals that would eventually provide historians with their most comprehensive account of Joshua Fletcher's program. He seemed to understand that the story needed to be preserved, even if it could not be told during his lifetime. His final journal entry, written 2 weeks before his death from heart failure, concluded with a passage that captured the unresolved tension at the center of his life. "I have spent a decade trying to atone for what I did to Joshua Fletcher and the others at Riverside, but I know that my efforts have been insufficient. I freed some, but not all. I advocated for limited reforms, but did not call for abolition. I provided quiet support for escapes, but continued operating a system built on human bondage. I have been neither fully evil nor fully good. And I suspect that this moral ambiguity is the true character of most men who operate within unjust systems. We tell ourselves that small improvements justify continued participation, that incremental change is better than no change at all. Perhaps this is true. Or perhaps it is simply the lie we tell ourselves to sleep at night while others suffer. I will never know which." The estate itself was sold in 1861, shortly after Grantham's death and at the beginning of the Civil War. The new owners operated it for only 4 years before abandoning it entirely in 1865 as Union forces moved through the region. The property was eventually subdivided and sold to formerly enslaved families during Reconstruction, though most of these families lost their land during the subsequent decades of Jim Crow oppression. The buildings deteriorated over time, and by the early 20th century, only ruins remained. The land was eventually absorbed into a nature preserve. And today, few people who walk those trails realize they are walking through the site of one of the most unusual episodes in the history of American slavery. The historical record of what occurred at Riverside Plantation in 1847 remained fragmentary and deliberately obscured for over a century. The agreement between Joshua and Grantham had included provisions for secrecy. Both men understood that full public knowledge of events would trigger consequences neither desired. Grantham's private journals were sealed until 1950, held by descendants who didn't fully understand their significance. The letters Joshua had prepared for abolition societies were never sent as the peaceful resolution of the crisis made them unnecessary. But copies were preserved in abolition society archives, where they lay unexamined for decades. The testimonies of Rebecca and the other women who participated were recorded but filed under misleading categories, making them difficult for researchers to locate. It wasn't until the 1990 seconds when historians began systematically examining plantation records and cross-referencing them with Abolition Society documents that the full scope of Joshua Fletcher's program became clear. A graduate student researching breeding programs discovered Grantham's journals and recognized their significance. Cross-referencing the journals with other documents revealed the testimonies of the women participants, Joshua's preserved letters and scattered references, and other plantation owners' correspondence. Slowly, painstakingly, the complete story emerged from archival fragments that had been separated and hidden for over a century. Even then, the story remained controversial. Some historians questioned the authenticity of the documents, while others debated the ethics of Joshua's actions and whether targeted reproductive coercion, even as education for oppressors, could be justified under any circumstances. Academic conferences featured heated debates about whether Joshua Fletcher should be celebrated as a resistance hero or criticized for perpetuating reproductive violence. Some scholars argued that his program represented sophisticated psychological warfare that exposed the fundamental violence of slavery, while others contended that using the tools of oppression, even against oppressors, corrupts the moral foundation of resistance. What remains undisputed is that something extraordinary occurred at Riverside Plantation in 1847. An enslaved man, using only his intelligence and understanding of the system that oppressed him, succeeded in temporarily reversing power dynamics and forcing those who had brutalized others to experience a fraction of that brutality themselves. He created a mirror that reflected the plantation system back upon those who benefited from it, revealing its fundamental cruelty in ways that abstract moral arguments never could. The children born from Joshua's program. There were ultimately 3 documented births over the following years. Grew up free in northern states, raised with full knowledge of their complex origins. Their descendants walk among us even today, some aware of the strange and unsettling origins of their bloodlines, others living in quiet ignorance. They carry within them the inherited legacy of both the enslaved and the enslavers, living proof of an encounter that was at once retaliation and instruction, vengeance and revelation. What Joshua Fletcher ultimately achieved remains open to interpretation. He did not end slavery. He did not dismantle the Southern economy built upon it. The concessions he forced from Elias Grantham III were limited, temporary, and soon swallowed by the larger machinery of oppression. Slavery would not fall because of one man's defiance, but through the violent upheaval of civil war, and yet Joshua proved something the plantation elite could never allow themselves to believe, that enslaved people were not voiceless tools, not passive property, but strategic minds capable of calculated resistance. He revealed that the same cold intelligence used to control human lives could be learned, mirrored, and turned back upon its creators. Even when his story was buried and obscured, history found a way to resurrect it, exposing what happens when power is briefly inverted and control shifts, however temporarily. The story of Joshua Fletcher and Riverside Plantation stands as one of deep moral complexity. Revenge became lesson. Coercion became demonstration. Violence was replaced with psychological reckoning. It forces us to confront unsettling questions. Can oppressive methods ever be morally justified if used to expose oppression itself? When every peaceful path has been stripped away, what forms of resistance remain permissible? Now we ask you, what do you think? Were Joshua Fletcher's actions a form of justice, or did they replicate the very cruelty he sought to reveal? Did the Grantham sons truly understand the lesson, or were they simply scarred by an experience they could never fully comprehend? And when human dignity is systemically denied, what resistance remains ethically defensible? Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us which country you're watching from. If this story challenged your perspective on power, resistance, and history, make sure you're subscribed to Vintage Chains. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss narratives that refuse to soften the truth. Share this video with those who value history that confronts discomfort instead of hiding from it. Because the past is never simple, justice is never pure, and the stories we bury are often the ones we most need to face. Until next time, remember, the chains of history may be old, but their echoes still shape the present.